Good evening, welcome. It's February. I know we only had a meeting a fortnight ago. Several people were confused by that as they were going home. And I then explained that we're now reverting to the first Friday in the month. The reason that we couldn't do it in January was because A, the community centre was closed, and B, it was over the Christmas period. So we would have all been stood outside, and I don't think that would have worked anyway. So you're all very welcome once again. Nice to see so many people in. For those of you that received the update, then you will know that this year the calendar for next year is going to be done in a slightly different way. We're looking for you, our members, to provide us with photographs. Bit of a competition. There will be a prize. So if you have photographs, or if you want to take photographs, if you can bring them to the monthly meetings in the first 4 or 5 months of the year, then we'll see what we've got and see where we can go with it. It saves us a job, you see. We don't have to look around for more photographs. It gets more and more difficult. We have a History Day. I'll remind you about this next month as well. In the library on Friday the 15th of March. Usual procedure. Starts at 10 o'clock. Photographic collection, artefacts and ancestry. And anything else we can grab hold of that will be something different and will be of interest. So, without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Julie Grier, who has travelled a long distance from Plasmatic, just up the road, to come and talk to us this evening. And the subject is From the Clwyd to the Nile, the Extraordinary Life of Edward Evans. Julie, thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Can I have a little bit more light here? Is that possible? Oh. Is that okay? Can people still see the screen? And before I start, it's lovely to see so many of you here on a February night, so thank you for coming. And can everyone hear me? I haven't got the biggest of voices. It's the first time I've ever worn a microphone, but I might get to like it, Chris. So it's going to be the shape of things to come. So if you can't hear me, please let me know. Tonight's talk is From the Clwyd to the Nile, the Extraordinary Life of Edward Baldwin Evans. Now, I've lived with Edward Evans for quite some time. I've become a little bit obsessed with him over the months and years. And so I'd like to introduce him to you tonight. You can see a picture of him here in all his exotic finery. But the picture was taken in Coventry. And if you're eagle-eyed, if you look in the background, I'm sure that's hollyhocks in the background. So you can imagine the photographer's studio thinking, oh my goodness, what backdrop do I use now? So this is Edward Evans. Before I go any further, I do have to thank some people. So, when I first started putting this talk together, I set myself the task of trying to find out as much about this gentleman as I could from the local papers, from published books. But we have actually managed to make contact with one of Edward's descendants. So I need to thank a lady by the name of Sheila Wolfe for some of the images that you'll see tonight. So thanks for Sheila and for her support of the talk. I will talk about Sheila again at the end. And also thank you to Sarah, because she gave me the details of the family tree that you'll see in a moment. And she made the connection with Sheila, so thank you for that, Sarah. So if you go to St Mary's Church and you walk down to the main entrance, if you look to your left, you'll see this monument. And I've always wondered about it. and the inscription on it. And then a little while ago, Lorna, who's in the audience, gave us a talk about Cadw and the 15-minute heritage project, which was trying to encourage groups to go out and look at the history on their doorstep. So that gave me the nudge to look into this. Having said that, tonight's talk is longer than 15 minutes. So I hope you're all comfortable, because it's quite a story. So that's the monument today. This is how it looked in 1886. And the memorial records that the local paper ran an article that said, "A Welsh hero. Last week, an obelisk of polished granite was placed in the churchyard bearing the following inscriptions. In memoriam, Major Edward Baldwin Evans, son of John and Jane Evans, born at Rhuddlan, October the 6th, 1843, and killed while serving as an interpreter and Chief of Intelligence Department with Hicks Pasha's army at El Obeid in the Sudan, November 1883. This monument is erected by his sisters and friends in loving remembrance." So I had to wonder how the heck a local boy ended up with Hicks Pasha's army in the Sudan, and how come this memorial was there. So trying to piece together parts of his life from the local paper, when news of his death came through, the North Wales Journal did write an article about that as well. And the journal in November 1883 stated that Mr. Edward Baldwin Evans, who was on the Intelligence Department under Hicks Pasha and who, it is feared, is among the slain, was a native of Rhuddlan near Rhyl, North Wales. His late father, John Evans, was very well known in the Principality as a Welsh scholar and antiquarian. About 16 years ago, so Edward would have been about 22, 23 at that point, so about 16 years ago, Mr. Evans went out to Alexandria to an English merchant. After passing several years in Cairo, he went to Jeddah, where he traded in his own right. He became a good linguist, especially in Arabic, and he became acquainted with the customs of Islam. And then it says, when the war broke out last year in Egypt, he joined the Intelligence Department attached to Sir Garnet Wolseley's army, and subsequently, when that war was over and the present expedition sent to the Sudan, he was selected out of many candidates as Chief of the Intelligence Department. So that fills in a little bit more. So in his early 20s, he managed to be apprenticed or to join up with a merchant out in Alexandria. But there's more to his story than this suggests as well. So, to begin the beginning, and as I say, Sarah has helped me put this together. This is a family tree of Edward, his immediate family. It can go further back, but I haven't got room on the slide. And you can see that this is perhaps the key to Edward's story. John, his father, born in 1804, married Jane, born in 1807, and Jane was 19 when they got married. Now, any women of a nervous disposition, look away now, because over the next 22 years they had 15 children, which, as the mother of two, fills me with admiration. So I think any young man who's ambitious, from a relatively humble background, if he wants to make his way, he leaves his home, doesn't he? It's a unique story for Edward, unique but also universal. And there'll be families across Wales, Scotland, Ireland, where this is part of their history. So you can see that John, I can see sort of peering at the dates. So they had their first child in 1826, Elizabeth, and then Jane, 1828, Mary, 29, Letitia 31, John comes, Jemima 1833, William 1834, and then George 1837, and on, with Edward being born in 1843 with 2 younger brothers. So that is quite a family. And I tried to have an idea of Edward's family. And so if you look back through the censuses, through marriage certificates, you can trace John, the father's, occupations. The family lived on the high street in Rhuddlan, so probably not a lot of room there. And over the years, John, Edward's father, is described as being an engraver, a stone engraver. For a while he's a schoolmaster. He's also a surveyor, and you can find instances in the paper of where there's a land dispute, they call in John to adjudicate. So John, Edward's father, was obviously well respected in the community. You have a picture of a close-knit family, a caring family, and I'll come back to that as well. Where education was important, he was a schoolmaster. The family was Welsh-speaking, and they were steeped in the Welsh culture. And if you try and piece together a bit more and find out more about Edward, there are 2 instances in his childhood. So in 1850, John, Edward's father, was an ovate at Rhuddlan Eisteddfod. And Edward would have been about 7 then, so he must have been aware of that honour and how important the Welsh language and Welsh culture certainly was to his father. And then a few years on from that, there's another little glimpse of Edward. And it says, Bodelwyddan Church, last Sabbath, a party of us went from Rhyl to have a view of the sacred edifice and to attend the Welsh evening service. We were delighted to hear 5 carols well sung according to the ancient British mode, one of which we much admired, written and the music also arranged by Mr. John Evans, High Street, Rhuddlan. It was admired by the congregation when sung by him and his children. His excellent bass voice filled the church well. So we have a glimpse of Edward, who would have been about 17, singing with his brothers and his sisters and his father at Bodelwyddan. And to sing in the ancient British mode, is that the plug-in that we've just had at St Asaph Cathedral? So very steeped in Welsh culture and language. Then we lose track of Edward for a few years. As I say, when he was 22, 23, he went out to Alexandria with as an apprentice to a merchant. But there are some key moments that are recorded in the papers. And these are the ones that I'm going to talk about tonight. He had an encounter with H.M. Stanley in Africa. He was vice-consul to Mecca in 1875. He seems to have been present at the British bombardment of Alexandria. He became an interpreter and intelligence officer with General Garnet Wolseley of the British Army. He was then involved in the defence of the populist Egyptian nationalist leader, Arabi Pasha. And then finally, he was on campaign with William Hicks, part of the Egyptian army. So, to take that first instance, in 1872, we know that he has met with H.M. Stanley, because Edward is the first man to out Stanley as a Welshman. H.M. Stanley denied his humble background from this area, and he claimed, and was vehemently claiming, that he was an American. But Edward knew otherwise. And Edward, when he was home on leave, wrote to the Rhyl Journal, and he said, As a great deal of discussion has recently taken place, both in England and Wales, as to whether Mr. Stanley, the discoverer of Dr. Livingstone, is an American or an Englishman, and as the correspondent of the Telegraph has stated that Mr. Stanley is an American, I think it will not be out of place as a personal friend of that gentleman to state the facts regarding his nationality. It was in Africa that my acquaintance with Mr. Stanley became intimate, and I must say we spent many happy hours together. We have dined together, we have drunk together, we have had a Welsh song together. Far away from home and friends, I knew him as Mr. Stanley, and as Mr. Rowlands, I knew his relatives in this neighbourhood. And since my return to this place 3 months ago, I have seen his mother, his sister and his cousin. Each one produced his likeness, and it proved, as I well knew before, that Mr. Stanley is Mr. Rowland, a Welshman, and of this there's not the slightest doubt. So he wrote that, and it was published by the Real Journal. And was H.M. Stanley grateful for the clarification? No, he was not. Miss H.M. Stanley is sent the clipping of the Real Journal by his friend Charles Oliphant. And he writes back to Oliphant, and Oliphant passes his letter on to the Daily News, and they publish it. So, H.M. Stanley writes, "My dear Oliphant, 1,000 thanks for your letter and clippings. If I were to answer all the letters that I've received about such questions as the Real Journal propounds, I would certainly be called an idiot, and deservedly so. I care not what anybody writes about me, nor do I intend to notice them. If English and Welsh folk are so gullible as they believe all the rots they read about me, I cannot help it, nor have I a desire to help it in any way. But for you and all kind friends, I say I am an American." The letter in the Real Journal is all bosh. I never knew a man named Evans, nor have I ever sung a Welsh song, not knowing anything of the language. My name is neither Thomas Rowland Smith, Jones, nor Robinson, but plain Henry M. Stanley. So, that didn't quite go as well as Edward might have hoped, perhaps. But I think I trust Edward better, as time proved him right. So, if we move on now, the next glimpse that we see of Edward in the local papers is in 1875. When he is appointed the vice-consul in Mecca. Now this is a real feather in his cap. This is the first rung of the diplomatic ladder, and quite something for a local lad from the High Street. It's quite an interesting time to become a diplomat. Up until this period, the consul was an honorary position. It wasn't salaried, there was no payment for the role, and it was usually done by a British merchant working in that area. And it was on top of his day job. As a merchant, the kudos that being a consul or a vice-consul probably helped your business. And so it was done for those reasons. But by 1875, it's become professionalised. They are starting to be paid, and there's starting to be a bit of a career ladder. Having said that, to be vice-consul at this time in Mecca was not an easy job. There were outbreaks of cholera frequently, and I'm sure Edward would have had to have dealt with sick British subjects. There was also the problem of pauper pilgrims. Obviously Mecca, for those of the Islamic faith, they want to go there on pilgrimage. And they had a problem that when pilgrims attended Mecca from British-controlled areas like India or African states under British control, once they got there, if they didn't have the wherewithal, the funds to get home again, the British government felt it reflected badly on them, and so they would pay their passage back. So I dare say that Edward had his work cut out, organising return trips for people, supporting sick or lost people, it wouldn't have been an easy role at all for him. Now, he was on the first rung of the ladder, and he might have followed that through, but he didn't. And just by way of comparison, this gentleman is John Kirk. He was of a similar background. He was Scottish. He did study and became a physician. He was a botanist and very interested in Africa. Because he was a botanist, he applied to join Livingstone's second Zambezi expedition, and he joined him but didn't like what he saw. He described Livingstone as a poor leader. He said he was out of his mind and a most unsafe leader. So John Kirk didn't leave with Livingstone for the next expedition. He stayed in Zanzibar. Now Zanzibar has the dubious notoriety of having the last slave market. And John Kirk was instrumental in getting that closed down. He was appointed, like Edward Evans, he was appointed a vice-consul, but he stayed there in Zanzibar and he was promoted up, rising to consul general. And as I say, he worked tirelessly to end the slave trade. And then when he came back to Britain, he was knighted. Now, this might have been Edward's trajectory, but for whatever reason, it wasn't. So the next part of Edward's life, we need a little bit of background, and this will be very brief, otherwise we'll be here for many hours. But very briefly, in 1869, the Suez Canal opens, which links the Red Sea. It's very important to Britain for trade, for links to India, and we can still see how important that route is now, because shipping's being diverted away from the Red Sea at the moment, isn't it, because it's unsafe. But the canal belonged to the Egyptian government, but there was a concessionary company operating it, and that was in mostly British and French hands. They owned the shares. So Britain was very interested in the Suez Canal, but not particularly in Egypt or the Sudan. So we'll put that to one side, because if we move on a few years, in mid-1870s, there's Egypt declares war on Ethiopia. Now, on paper, Egypt should have won, because Ethiopia was much poorer, didn't have as many resources as Egypt. But they lost, and there was an army officer by the name of Ahmed Urabi. He's also known as Urabi Pasha, or Arabi Pasha, it's spelled lots of different ways. Now, Urabi Pasha was very unusual in that he was of peasant stock, a fellow in peasant ancestry, and he worked his way up through the ranks to become an officer. Egypt was part of the Ottoman Turkish Empire. Most of the officers' posts went to people from the Ottoman Turkish Empire, not native-born Egyptians. So he came back incensed at the way that the war had been mismanaged, that the finances in Egypt were mismanaged, and at the European influence in his country. And he turns to politics. He wants equal standing for Egyptians under the law. He wants better opportunities for Egyptians, and as I say, to wrest the country back from European influence. Most of his followers are in the army, and by 1879, Arabi forms the Egyptian Nationalist Party. The ruling Khedive, Ismail, was very profligate. He was in hock to the British and very unpopular, and he is deposed and replaced by his son Tewfik. And for a few years, Arabi and Tewfik rub along okay together. But by 1882, Tewfik is concerned at Arabi's popularity and basically calls in the British against this populist leader to bolster his position. The British send gunboats and they anchor off Alexandria and point their guns at Alexandria. At this point, Alexandria is a tinderbox, and this is seen as an aggressive act. And so there are spontaneous riots, 6 Europeans are killed in the riots, and the British use that as the reason to bombard and then enter Egypt. So Arabi gets blamed for the uprising, but there was never any evidence that he instigated the protests that killed the Europeans. In fact, he sent the army in to try and protect them. But things escalated, and in the end, the Indian contingent of the British Army goes in under General Garnet-Wolseley and defeats Arabi at the Battle of Tel el-Kebir. Now, there will be questions on that later. So, that was a whistle-stop tour. But this is a picture of Arabi Pasha. He was very popular, charismatic leader and much loved by his countrymen. This is the after effects of that British bombardment. As I say, that in the riots, 6 Europeans were killed. The British bombarded Alexandria for 10.5 hours, but there's no record of how many fatalities or injuries came as a result of it. And then finally, the uprising is completely put down at the Battle of Tel el-Kebir, and there's General Garnet-Wolseley. This is a picture of the entry of the Khedive into Cairo, Khedive Ismail, Tewfik rather, accompanied by Sir Garnet-Wolseley. And we know, finally, we get back to Edward Evans. We know that Edward Evans was present at this because we've got extracts from his diary. So, not a while after this, there was a fundraiser in the Ebenezer just down the road. And the fundraiser was to raise money for the widows and orphans of soldiers killed at Tel el-Kebir. And as part of the fundraiser, they read out extracts from Edward's diary. So, he wrote of entering Cairo, and it says, on my arrival there, I presented myself at the headquarters, and I was pleased to hear there was a substantial dinner to be given that evening by the Khedive at the palace, placed at the disposal of the staff. The room I occupied, like the others, was gorgeously furnished. The Brussels carpet on the floor was as soft as the meadows of old England. The sofas all round and the window hangings were simply superb. I have seen nothing like it before or since. This gilded hall of luxury and formerly of vice once belonged to Ismail Pasha, the deposed Khedive. It was here that he practiced his midnight orgies with strange women, and the very place where formerly Jacob is supposed to have settled down to farming at the invitation of his son Joseph. The report in the paper goes on to note that the meeting was also enlivened by the rendering of a few choruses by the children's choir, conducted by Mr. William Hughes, and Miss Maggie Jones, Scribber sang sweetly Kyrie eleison. So what the children made of the midnight orgies is not recorded, but I'm sure the parents had some explaining to do. Again, thanks to the lady I mentioned at the start, she has, Sheila Wolfe, she has sent an image of the first page of Edward's diary. So we have there a picture of his own handwriting and the start of his diary. And it's the 10th, written in Jeddah, August 10th, 1882, so before the Battle of Tel el-Kebir, which is quite poignant to see, isn't it? This is what the British press made of the battle, and you can see there it's the Lions Just Share in Punch, And the British lion has got the poor old Egyptian crocodile, and seen off the Russian bear and the Austro-Hungarian eagle and the Italian donkey and French poodle, etc. So what we were interested in was the Suez Canal. What we ended up having been pulled into was Egyptian politics, but not just Egyptian politics, because below, on the map below Egypt, is the Sudan, which was always under Egypt's sphere of influence, and that's what's on the horizon next, but I'll come to that in a moment. So, what of Arabi after the Battle of Tel Al-Kebir? He had surrendered to the British Army after the battle, and this was a problem because the British were there under spurious grounds, really. Should Arabi be brought back to Britain and tried, and if so, tried for what? Or should he be handed over to the Egyptians and court-martialed? And to cut a long story short, he was handed over to the Egyptians for court-martial in Egypt. But he had his supporters, not just at home, but abroad. Now, this is Wilfrid Blunt. He was extremely well-heeled, well-connected. He was born in Petworth House in Sussex. He married the daughter of Ada Lovelace and the granddaughter of Lord Byron. He was Bohemian. He travelled far and wide in Spain and Algeria and Egypt, and he was by nature anti-imperialist. He championed the cause of Irish independence and ended up in Kilmainham jail at one point, and he was also barred from Egypt for 4 years for his support of Arabi Pasha. Now, he bankrolled Arabi Pasha's defence of the court-martial to the tune of 10,000 guineas. And he employed Alexander Meyrick Broadley as the QC to defend Arabi Pasha. Meyrick Broadley had practiced law in India. He was au fait with Islamic law, and he seemed to be the right man for this job. So, the first thing that Mr. Broadley does is to hire Edward Evans as his interpreter for Arabi Pasha during the court-martial. So Edward makes an appearance again here. Okay. This is a picture of Arabi at the time of his arrest. And we know that Edward Evans struck up a very close friendship with Arabi Pasha during that time. And we know that because the Real Advertiser in 1882 publishes a letter written by Edward Evans. Now, Edward had written to his friend Robert Jones, the shipbuilder in Rhyl and the Forest, and he passes the letter to the local paper, and the Real Advertiser publishes the letter. And the article says, I know you can't read it, so I'll read a little bit of it out. It says, "This Mr. Evans is the same gentleman as reported to be murdered at Alexandria before the bombardment." So it was feared that he'd been one of the Europeans killed, but he wasn't. And it said, "My dear Robert, I'm writing you these few lines on Arabi's table in prison. He himself is occupied in writing out his accounts of the rebellion and consults me occasionally about dates. I must say I am much impressed with his story of the attempt he made to liberate Egypt. It's a great pity the massacres took place, otherwise he would have been in a very different position. I came here with the army and I was in the front during the whole campaign, also at the action of Tel Al-Kebir. The other day I made a great haul in getting possession of Arabi's papers, and some of them are very important. If you look in the graphic next week, you will see a picture of Mr. E.B. Evans, Ridlin, and I dare say you know the gentleman. I am at work night and day in this matter until I'm almost completely done, yet I get up fresh in the morning after only a couple of hours' sleep. What a pleasant, quiet life you fellows have at home, compared with the active and excited times that have always fell to my lot. I had so often promised to write to you that I thought this a capital opportunity, and before I close it, I will ask Arabi to put his hand on it, which will enable you to tell your friends it has been in his hands. How are things in Nile? I suppose they are pretty much the same. I should like to go there next summer very much, but I'm afraid I cannot, as there's talk of sending me a long distance into the upper country, where a rebel is advancing on Egypt with a large army. Kind remembrance to those whom you know, good old friends both to yourself and me. Believe me, yours very truly, Ted Evans. P.S. Amai Arabi wedi rhoi cwisan a llyfr yna. I told him it was for a very old friend, and he at once touched it with his lips. Now, I think that shows how important the friendship was to Edward and how taken he was with Arabi. Now, the outcome of the trial was that Arabi Pasha was sentenced to death. But Mr. Broadley, the QC, got it commuted to exile. And so Arabi and his family and close followers were exiled to Sri Lanka for many years. He did come back to Egypt for the last few years of his life, but by then his health was broken and he didn't play any more part in Egyptian politics. We know that the feeling was mutual because, that's the picture in the graphic that Edward Evans mentioned was going to be published, and that's Edward Evans seated in the middle. He's got centre stage there, hasn't he? We know that Arabi Pasha had high regard for Edward as well, because a letter from Arabi to Edward was also published in the local press. And he had written to Edward, "In the name of God the merciful and compassionate, my good and honourable friend Mr. Evans, I beg to offer you my devotion for the great zeal and trouble you have taken on our behalf during the examination of our case, and also for your frequent visits to assist us in our prison cell. I pray God to reward you your great kindness to us in our hours of grief and darkness, and we beg of you to accept our most grateful thanks. I've done this in my own hand to be a remembrance and a lasting sign of the great esteem and friendship I have for you." And he signed it with his own hand. So, after the trial, Mr. Broadley writes up his memoirs and his thoughts about defending Arabi. And on page 57 of his book, we hear that we engaged as our chief interpreter a straightforward young Welshman, Edward Baldwin Evans, who has recognised H.M. Stanley as a fellow countryman in the deserts of Sudan, spent a time in exploring the Red Sea coast and returned to Egypt with the Indian contingent. He did us good service and remained with us to the last. Mr. Evans is now with Hicks Pasha in search of the Mahdi. But while this was being put to press, news comes of the Battle of El Obeid. And so he writes a preface, and he wrote, "While this volume has been passing through the press, all England has been startled by the intelligence of Hicks Pasha's defeat in the Sudan. One of our most valued assistants at Cairo has found an untimely grave in the battle before Obeid. There appears to be no doubt that Edward Baldwin Evans, our faithful and zealous interpreter, has been one of the victims of this great disaster." So, Edward had written that he'd like to come home to Nile, but he might be sent up country because a rebel was advancing. And the rebel was Muhammad Ahmed, otherwise known as the Mahdi, or the Chosen One. He was a charismatic religious leader, There was a lot of superstition surrounding him. It was said that he had supernatural powers, that he couldn't be killed, that bullets and knives wouldn't penetrate his body or the body of his followers. And after the court-martial of Arabi Pasha and his exile, Arabi had been an army officer. A lot of his supporters were soldiers in the Egyptian army. So after that uprising, much of the Egyptian army was put into prison. And so Egypt was very exposed. It had imprisoned its army. The British didn't really want to be drawn in. They wanted to control the Suez Canal and didn't want to be drawn in further. So a country without an army is the prime time for the neighbours to kick up a fuss. So this was extremely good timing for the Mahdi to have an uprising in Sudan. For the next bit of Edward's life, there is a little bit more background. As I say, Arabi's army had been disbanded and they had lost their military leader in Arabi. So they employed William Hicks to take charge as Chief of Staff of the Egyptian army. Now, William Hicks was a British army officer who had spent his time in India and he had retired. But he comes along basically as a mercenary. He is in it for the money and for hopefully the glory. And he becomes Chief of Staff of the Egyptian army. But the Egyptian army is released from prison in chains and handed over to William Hicks to forge into some sort of fighting army. It's not going to go well. This army has just fought the British at the Battle of Tel Akabir, and now they've been put under a British army officer. Not only that, they haven't been paid for 6 months. Their pay is 6 months in arrear, and they are extremely demoralised. At this point, Edward Evans has finished his role as interpreter for Arabi, and he actively seeks to serve as a civilian interpreter with William Hicks, or Hicks Pasha. He has this honorary title bestowed on him. And Hicks' army has some initial success suppressing the uprising in one particular area of the Sudan. But at that point, the Mahdi's supporters were largely unarmed. William Hicks, at that point, he was a career soldier. He wanted to stop and consolidate. But the Khedive and the Egyptian advisors are insisting that he press on and completely suppress the uprising in the rest of Sudan and engage with the Mahdi directly. It meant moving away from his supply lines, and by that time the Mahdi's army was vastly superior, and when they did come to the final engagement, Hicks's army was completely annihilated in a brutal fashion. But we still hear things about Edwards in the local paper. The advertiser, Real Advertiser in 1883 says a letter's just been received from Mr. Evans. He states he's gone with General Hicks as Chief of the Intelligence Department with the rank of Captain to the Sudan to meet the false prophet. He expects to be away for about 8 months on this expedition and expresses a very poor opinion of the demoralised Egyptian troops as being able to cope with the troops of the false prophet and to check his march effectually. And he was very right to be concerned. Because the troops hadn't been paid, some of them deserted, some of them stole supplies and sold them to the Mahdi supporters, because they hadn't been paid themselves. It just was never going to go well. This is a picture of Hicks in the middle, looking with his arms folded, and you can see Edward Evans in civilian clothes at the back. And see if I can use this. This gentleman here was the only one to survive, because just before the battle, that's Colonel Colborne, just before the battle he got dysentery, so he was sent back to recuperate, and he survived, and he lived to write his memoirs. This is the same picture, a little bit clearer, and later on, Churchill fought in the Battle of Omdurman, which was a couple of battles after this, and he wrote about the whole campaign and described Hicks Pasha and his army as perhaps the worst army that has ever marched to war. It was stacked against them. But he's still in touch with everyone at home. Numerous friends of Captain E.B. Evans will no doubt be glad to know that letters have been received from him for Khartoum, in which he states he is well and on the point of starting across an arid, waterless desert with the expedition against the false prophet under General Hicks. Also that he has been recommended for further promotion to the rank of Major, to enable him to act with greater authority as General Hicks' political agent in the country. This is a picture of Hicks's route, and he had an initial success putting down the uprising in the Sennar region, and that was in part due to Edward Evans' network of spies. Edward Evans had recruited spies and got wind of an attack, so Hicks was ready for the attack, and Hicks won that round, as it were. And that was when Edward was promoted after that. And Hicks wanted to stop at that point, as I say, consolidate. But his paymasters insisted that he carry on. And you can see that as he's going down the route of the Nile, he can get supplies. As soon as he goes across the desert, he's running short of supplies, he's running short of water, his soldiers are deserting him. He was heading for El Obeid because there was a fortress there with Egyptian soldiers in it, and the Mahdi was besieging it. But before they get there, they get word that the fortress has fallen. So they can't lift the siege. Their only hope is to engage the Mahdi in one direct battle and hope that they win. Oh, what have I done? There we go, that's it. So we hear again about Edward Evans in this book. This is with Hicks Pasha in the Sudan, and it's the memoirs of Colonel Colborne. That was the gentleman at the back who had dysentery and survived. So he says, we had no time, this is from Colonel Colborne's book, we had no time to order uniforms, so we had to provide ourselves with grey serge issued to Tommy Atkins in Egypt, and khaki jackets that were hurriedly trimmed with gold lace, denoting our respective ranks. So they had to provide their own uniforms. It says, interpreter Edward Evans was given the honorary rank of captain. There had been some difficulty in our taking Mr. Evans with us. His Highness the Khedive suggested the employment of one of his own officers in the capacity of interpreter. That was a penny-pinching proposal. General Hicks, however, represented to His Highness the desirability of employing Mr. Evans, and he received his commission. And he goes on to say, poor Evans did us excellent service. He had previously visited the Sudan. In addition to his value as a linguist, he was a cheerful and indefatigable campaigner and an excellent comrade. And it said how he had recruited spies before the Battle of Moravia when he was promoted. Hicks, we also know what Hicks there's a picture that I've received recently, and that would have been Edward Evans in his uniform. Hicks was very definitely in this for the kudos for the money. He was a very harsh disciplinarian. Floggings were the order of the day. But he was under-resourced, and he was in an awkward position. He was a British Army officer. He expected the British to support him, but the British government, under Gladstone at that time, didn't want to be drawn in and didn't support him. I think the British government would have been happy to take the glory if he'd been successful, but they adopted hands-off. This is an internal Egyptian problem, this uprising. They didn't really want to be drawn in. They certainly didn't want to support it with money. And this Hicks couldn't quite understand. And he wrote home how the campaign would go. He wrote home to his wife almost daily. And he wrote, I see a KCMG out of this, Sir William and Lady Hicks. And he goes on to complain about how he had to fight to get the interpreters. As the campaign goes on, his letters are increasingly desperate. He's aware that things are going extremely badly for him, and he starts lashing out at everyone. And in his letters, he doesn't have a good word to say about any of his officers. He wrote home that 2 officers on my staff make £700 and £480 a year by writing for a paper. The Daily News pays £700 a year to a man here who can't write a page of sense. If he was having second thoughts, so was Edward Evans. Because in August 1883, just a few months before that final battle, Hicks wrote to his wife, "To add to my comfort, Captain Evans, my interpreter, sent me in his resignation. A nice piece of ingratitude after all I've done for him. He came to me 20 times in Cairo begging me to get him appointed and saying he would take any pay. After an immensity of trouble, I got him appointed on £400 a year, much more than he would have been glad to get. I afterwards got him a commission as captain. He was a civilian. I shall not let him go. If he chooses to desert, that is another thing." Well, Edward didn't have much of a choice, did he? And the next day, Hicks writes home to his wife, "Evans, I am glad to say, has thought better of his wish to resign and has been up to see me this morning." So you can see a picture of an army in dire straits. Not just that, Edward's network of spies recruits 2 soldiers that say they're fleeing from the fortress of El Obeid, that they've managed to escape, and they want to sign up with Hicks. And as the interpreter, he would have interrogated them. But they were not what they seemed. Hicks writes home that the soldier told us he had deserted and left Obeid 8 days before. He gave me a lot of information. He was recognised by some men with the army who knew him formally. He was enlisted into one of our regiments and marched with us for 4 days. At the end of 4 days, he stole a camel and went off as hard as he could for Obeid, taking with him 2 months' advance pay, rifle, 120 rounds of ammunition, clothing besides the camel. He was a spy of the Mahdi's and has been able to collect and give him all our information. Evans told me afterwards that he had heard the man telling several of the army that 3 men had attempted to murder the Mahdi by stabbing him, but the knives wouldn't enter his body. So much for my intelligence officer. He was allowed to preach this to an ignorant soldiery for 4 days. But as I say, Hicks is cornered and he's lashing out at everyone. So, everyone knows that this is not going well. And finally, before the battle, Edward makes his will. And what he writes is, "My dear James," James was his brother-in-law. James had married one of Edward's sisters. "We are 18 days on the march from Khartoum. The enemy is reported to be 30 miles ahead of us. The battle will take place in a few days. In case anything should occur, please recover my pay through the British consul in Cairo, who will encash it from the Egyptian government. I have kept an account of it in a book which I have left with my baggage in Khartoum. But in case this should be lost, you will be able to get at the balance due to me by application at the Imperial Ottoman Bank in Cairo, where it is paid to my credit monthly. The pay is at the rate of £400 per annum from the 1st of April to the 15th of August last. After that date, it was risen to £500. I have received some on account for which I have given receipts, which the government must present. The balance I wish equally divided between my sisters, but they must subscribe £20 for a memorial in Ridland churchyard." So we've almost come full circle. And I think you have to admire Edward's, that his thoughts are for those sisters that are dependent on him. And he's spelling out to the last penny almost what they should have. That's almost the end of the story, but not quite. The Battle of El Obeid was 1883. In 1885, there are questions asked in Parliament, and the Under-Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs was asked whether his attention had been called to the case of the late Edward Baldwin Evans, interpreter to the expedition under Hicks Pasha, and who was killed therein together with the general officer, whether, having lived for many years in Alexandria, Cairo, Hejaz, and carried dispatches from the consul to Suez, he, E.B. Evans, found the Indian contingent on its way to the front and was engaged in the intelligence department with the honorary rank of captain, pay at £400 per annum. That he was at Tel el-Kebir and afterwards was employed as interpreter for Mr. Broadley in the Egyptian state trials, that he received his commission from the Khedive, that after the Battle of Moravia his rank was raised to that of major with pay of £500, that for his valuable service he was promised the Egyptian government a gratuity of 6 months' pay, whether, notwithstanding, no such gratuity has been paid to his sisters, who were dependent on him for support, and who are now in straitened circumstances. There is still outstanding arrear of 2 months' pay that accrued due before the fate of the expedition, and whether the government will use its influence to see right done. We can only assume that right was done because the monument was built. But I hope you agree that Edward had quite an extraordinary life. And for a lad born in the High Street to be fluent in Arabic and to have done the things he did and to have died at such a young age is quite phenomenal. Thank you. There is one thing I would say. The lady Sheila Wolfe, who we have made contact with now, has written a booklet about her family history, not just Edward, but the wider family as well. It's called The Dragon and the Rose, Many Voices, One Story. I don't think it's available yet, but if anyone was interested in it, I'm sure that Sarah could put you in touch with Sheila. Okay, thank you.
Julie.
I feel like I've been talking about it and it doesn't get through to me.
I don't know how long it took me to research all of that, but that was very interesting, and thank you very much. I mean, this is about the third time that you've been to speak to this society now. You are a member of the society, but it's about the third time you've been to speak to us, and they are presentations which Julie has researched herself. So I think we're very grateful to Julie for having somebody that's got so much patience in researching local people, in fact. So, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
I don't know if there are any questions for Judy. There's one over here.
Oh.
You're not let off the hook yet.
The Evans family you're talking about in
Yes.
High Street. Do you know where they live in High Street?
Well, there are the two numbers are given. The numbers given are number 3, the High Street, number 13, the High Street. But whether the numbering has changed over the years, I'm not sure. But which one's number 3 and which one's number 13? Do we know?
There's always been an Evans family
Right.
in Woodburn there.
Yeah.
I think not that many years ago. One was a funeral director.
Right.
And then he had brothers, the York Evans,
Yeah.
at the post office with his wife.
Yeah.
I brought a photograph tonight of a group, and it's got a lady on it called Olga Evans,
Right.
who's York Evans' daughter.
Right.
So I'm wondering
If there's a connection.
Same.
I don't think there is. Oh, Sarah? Sarah? No, I don't think there is.
It's not the same Evans family.
Yeah.
We're talking of Evans from 7 High Street is the one that I'm talking about. Ours is further down.
Yeah, yeah. And I don't think any of the Evans stayed in this area. I think there are Evans from, you know, not just direct descendants, obviously, because he didn't have children, but there are family members in Australia and Warwickshire and elsewhere, but I don't think they stayed here. But it was so important to Edward, wasn't it, to have that memorial put here. And I believe Sheila Wolfe, his descendant, says that is the only monument that exists for anyone marking that battle. That's right, isn't it? Yeah. So that's quite something, isn't it? We have a monument following on from the war memorial talk last month. That battle isn't commemorated anywhere else but Midland Churchyard. Yes.
Well, thank you again, Julie. We just wonder who you're going to dig up next.
Oh, not literally. That's me. I've moved somewhere when I better stay here or switch it off.
Don't move, don't move. Yeah. Next month, Friday the 1st of March, no, St David won't be here to speak to us, but we will be celebrating St David's Day. Completely different subject. Peter Robinson, who is known to most of us, is going to come and talk about the wreck of the Ocean Monarch. So that will be here on Friday the 1st of March. Peter, as you probably know, or if you don't, you may remember, he deals with all things water. He was a diver, he was a plumber, and he was also coxswain of the real lifeboat. And any donations that he receives for speaking goes to the RLI. And he always brings with him a selection of RLI gifts. So he will be bringing those. So don't come with an empty purse. It just leaves me to thank you all again for coming this evening and to hand over to Hayden, who's going to do the raffle. I noticed that there were eggs and jelly babies, so if you win those, you can go away with a jelly baby on them.